Imagine this moment. You're 70 years old. You've survived 7 decades of struggle. This morning's interview, it might be your last chance to avoid losing everything. Your resume is perfect. Your late wife's favorite suit is pressed. Everything is finally falling into place after months of rejection. Then you see her, a stranger, hurt and alone, abandoned by everyone around you. Your last chance at dignity or a stranger's safety? At 70, what would you choose? The piercing shriek of an alarm clock shattered. The pre-dawn silence at 5:47 a.m. And Samuel Thompson's weathered hand shot out from beneath his threadbare comforter to silence it before the second ring could disturb his granddaughter, sleeping in the adjacent room. He remained motionless for several seconds, his 70-year-old eyes tracing the expanding water stain on the ceiling, a brownish constellation that had grown noticeably larger after the previous week's storm, the landlord still ignoring his repeated messages. The studio apartment felt frigid as Chicago's early spring mornings possessed a particular quality of cold that infiltrated through every crack in the aging window frame, his joints aching more in the cold, a cruel reminder that his body was no longer the reliable machine it had been for 6 decades. Samuel exhaled slowly, watching his breath materialize as a small cloud in the dim light, then swung his legs over the side of the bed with deliberate care, each step calculated to avoid the sharp pain in his lower back as he made his way to the small kitchenette where the $20 thrift store coffee maker sputtered and hissed, while the weak, bitter coffee brewed carefully, rationed to last the entire week. Samuel gently opened the door to the bedroom where 12-year-old Destiny slept, her small form barely making an impression on the twin mattress, clutching a stuffed elephant with one missing eye from a church donation drive years ago, his chest constricted with the familiar weight of responsibility and love as he watched her breathe, knowing that after her mother, his daughter, had died from complications of diabetes 3 years ago, Destiny had become his entire world, and she deserved considerably more than their current circumstances could provide. Returning to the kitchen, Samuel retrieved his ancient laptop that took nearly 3 minutes to power on, its fan whirring loudly before the screen finally flickered to life, displaying an email he had reviewed at least 20 times since its arrival. 2 days earlier, subject interview invitation, data entry specialist position. Dear Mr. Thompson, thank you for your application to Sterling Technologies. We are impressed with your extensive work history and would like to invite you for an in-person interview on Friday, March 22nd at 9 a.m. The position was entry-level, just data entry, but at 70, Samuel couldn't afford to be proud. The salary of $38,000 annually would mean keeping this apartment, consistent meals for Destiny, her school supplies, without the gnawing guilt of choosing between notebooks and electricity. Samuel closed his eyes, and the memory overwhelmed him as it invariably did during quiet moments. His forced retirement at 65 from the manufacturing plant where he had worked for 43 years, the company calling it restructuring, though Samuel understood it as what it truly was, clearing out the older workers to make room for younger, cheaper labor. The pension he'd been promised had evaporated in the company's bankruptcy. His Social Security barely covered rent, and the savings he and his late wife Martha had accumulated over decades had been consumed by her medical bills. During her final 2 years before Destiny arrived orphaned and traumatized, needing stability Samuel could barely provide. Black men work until we die or until they decide we're no longer useful, his father had told him once, his voice laden with a lifetime of evidence. And even then, we don't get to rest, we just become invisible. Samuel carried those words like a stone, lodged in his chest, understanding them now with the clarity that only 7 decades of living could provide as he glanced at the stack of bills on the counter: electric, internet, rent, Destiny's asthma medication, the electric bill bearing a red final notice stamp with only 3 days until disconnection. The income from his weekend custodial work at a downtown office building wasn't sufficient. Never was. His body aching after each shift with knees swelling until he could barely walk. But at 70, options were scarce, and today could alter that trajectory. Samuel carefully positioned his one quality suit, a navy blue ensemble. Martha had bought him for their 40th anniversary, just months before her diagnosis, on a hanger, having pressed it the previous evening with his arthritic hands working slowly but deliberately, eliminating every wrinkle until it appeared dignified. His resume printed on cream-colored paper and secured in a worn leather folder that had survived 3 decades of job searches. He checked his flip phone, not a smartphone he couldn't afford or fully understand, confirming. The bus departed at 7:45 a.m. for the 40-minute journey downtown, where he would arrive by 8:30 a.m. with adequate time to catch his breath, perhaps acquire an inexpensive breakfast, and enter with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through 7 decades. Everything was meticulously planned, everything was prepared. Though he knew what they would see when he walked in, an old man, perhaps too old, perhaps obsolete in a world of young workers and new technology. But Samuel had spent his entire life proving people wrong about what he was capable of, and he wasn't stopping now. Destiny stirred in the bedroom, and Samuel approached to gently brush a strand of hair from her face as she blinked awake, her brown eyes, so much like her mother's, focusing on him while he whispered, "Morning, sweetheart," in his voice gravelly from age and years of factory dust. "Is today the important day, Grandpa?" she murmured, still partially asleep. And when he confirmed, "Yes, baby, today's the day," she smiled and sat up to wrap her arms around his neck, telling him, "You're going to do great. Grandpa, you're the strongest person I know." He held her close, breathing in the scent of the discount shampoo they shared. His eyes stinging with tears he refused to let fall as he promised. "I'm going to make things better for us. I promise," and she responded, with the absolute faith only a child could possess. "I know you will. You always do." Samuel kissed her forehead and stood slowly, his knees protesting, his resolve hardening into steel because today was the day. Regardless of what it required, he'd survived 70 years of this world trying to break him, and one more interview wouldn't defeat him now. The number 56 bus was already crowded when Samuel boarded at 7:47 a.m., maneuvering through the narrow aisle with careful steps, his worn leather folder pressed protectively against his chest to shield it from the crush of bodies and air that was dense with perspiration, inexpensive cologne, and lingering fast food breakfast, smells under flickering fluorescent lights casting everything in sickly yellow illumination. He located a position near the middle, standing with one hand gripping the overhead rail and the other clutching a support pole for additional stability since his balance wasn't what it used to be. Surrounded by Chicago's working class pressed together in uncomfortable proximity, a woman in hospital scrubs scrolling through her phone, a construction worker with paint-splattered jeans gazing out the window, a teenager with headphones bobbing his head to inaudible music. Samuel could feel their occasional glances, the way younger passengers' eyes would skip over him as if he were furniture rather than a person, because 70 years had taught him that invisibility came with age, especially for black men who'd outlived their perceived usefulness. Though he mentally reviewed his prepared responses to interview questions while checking his 40-year-old Timex watch that read 8:03, still acceptable, still on schedule, despite the elevated heart rate that had plagued him since waking. Near the front of the bus, in one of the priority seats, sat an elderly white woman who appeared to be in her late 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat arrangement, and a wool coat that had clearly seen better days, her face etched with deep lines that spoke of a long life while she held a worn leather purse in her lap with both hands that trembled slightly. There was something dignified about her posture, despite the obvious pain she was attempting to conceal, the manner in which she shifted, her weight every few seconds, the slight grimace when the bus hit a pothole, the way her jaw clenched against discomfort. Samuel recognized intimately from his own daily struggles. Margaret Collins had been an educator for 42 years, though Samuel didn't know this yet. But what he did know in that moment was that she looked exhausted with the bone-deep exhaustion that came not from a single sleepless night but from years of a body slowly failing, despite a spirit that refused to quit. The bus driver, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a perpetual scowl, barked into his radio about being behind schedule while passengers swayed with each jerky movement in the collective choreography of public transit that Samuel had performed thousands of times across 7 decades. At 8:17 a.m., as the bus approached a major intersection downtown, a car cut sharply into the lane and the driver slammed on the brakes with no warning. No gradual deceleration, just a violent stop that sent everyone lurching forward while Samuel's grip on the rail saved him from falling through the sudden movement, sent pain shooting through his shoulder. Margaret, who had been shifting in her seat to ease the pain in her lower back with her hands loosening their grip on her purse for just a moment, wasn't prepared as the sudden stop threw her forward with merciless physics that didn't account for age or fragility, her arthritic hands unable to react quickly enough to catch herself as she tumbled from the seat onto the hard rubber floor, with a sickening impact that Samuel felt in his own bones, her hip taking the full force. Her cry of pain was sharp and unmistakable, a sound that cut through the ambient noise of the bus like a blade, a sound Samuel knew because he'd heard Martha make that same sound when she'd fallen in their bathroom 2 years before her death. And for a moment that stretched impossibly long, everything froze before came the shuffle of uncomfortable movement, the collective turning away as the woman in scrubs grimaced and deliberately returned to her phone. The construction worker met Samuel's eyes briefly, then turned to his window with practiced indifference, and the teenager didn't even remove his headphones. The bus driver didn't rise from his seat, didn't even unbuckle his seatbelt as he looked in his rearview mirror with an expression hardening into something between annoyance and calculation, calling out, "Ma'am, I can't have you falling on my bus, you all right?" In a voice flat and devoid of compassion. Margaret tried to push herself up, but her face contorted in agony that Samuel recognized instantly. The specific pain of a hip injury, the kind that could mean months of recovery for someone their age, if full recovery came at all. As she managed to say, I think I hurt my hip badly, please. I just need," before the driver interrupted with, "I'm not getting sued." "Lady, if you're injured, you gotta get off at the next stop." The bus pulled forward again with another lurch, and Margaret bit back a sob that made Samuel's chest tighten with recognition and rage as she managed to pull herself onto her hands and knees, trembling with the effort, her purse spilling its contents, wallet, reading glasses, pill bottles that scattered and rolled under seats, while 2 more blocks passed before the bus stopped at a corner, not a main stop or shelter, but just a desolate stretch where the driver decided to open the doors and announced, "This is you," with the finality of a judge's gavel. No one helped her stand, no one offered a hand, no one even made eye contact as Samuel watched from his position in the middle of the bus, his weathered hands clenched white-knuckled around the support pole. His jaw tightened while he looked at his watch reading, 8:21. The bus would reach his stop in 12 minutes. Then a 5-minute walk to Sterling Technologies, where he'd still have time to compose himself, maybe grab that cheap coffee, and walk in ready to prove that 70 wasn't obsolete. Margaret limped toward the door, using the seats for support, each step seeming to cost her everything, the kind of everything Samuel understood intimately, the pain that radiated, the dignity that frayed, the humiliation of a body that betrayed you in public while strangers watched, until she made it to the top of the steps and looked down at the gap between the bus and the curb, an impossible distance given her pain, a chasm that might as well have been a canyon. The driver sighed loudly, theatrical in his impatience with, "Come on, lady, I got a schedule." And Samuel felt something crack inside his chest as he saw his Martha in that hesitation, saw his own future in that abandonment, saw 70 years of invisible people, discarded people, inconvenient people being left on curbs to fend for themselves, while Margaret descended slowly with ragged, painful breathing until her foot touched pavement and she stumbled, barely catching herself on a nearby signpost, her face pale and eyes squeezed shut against tears and pain. The doors hissed shut behind Margaret with mechanical indifference, and the bus started to move while Samuel stood frozen, staring out the window at the elderly woman now standing alone on a desolate stretch of road where buildings were mostly warehouses and closed storefronts. No coffee shops, no pedestrians, no benches, just empty sidewalks and distant traffic rumble, and a woman who looked exactly like what she was, abandoned. His hand tightened around his folder containing 38 years of work history, references from supervisors long retired or dead, certificates from training programs in obsolete technologies. His eyes moving to his watch, reading 8:22, then back to Margaret, who was now lowering herself onto the curb with excruciating slowness, her face buried in her trembling hands as the bus picked up speed. Samuel's heart pounded, not with exertion but with the familiar dangerous pressure that had sent 3 of his friends to early graves, the pressure his doctor had warned him about, while his mind raced through calculations. He'd performed 1,000 times in 70 years. Every minute that passed, every block the bus traveled was a minute closer to his last chance. That interview was possibly his final shot. Maybe his only shot, because at 70, employers didn't give second chances. At 70, missing an interview meant another month of watching destiny go without. Another month of rationing medication. Another month of feeling like a failure to the one person who still believed in him. But the image of Margaret alone and in pain seared itself into his consciousness as Samuel thought of Martha collapsing in that parking lot while people walked past, thought of his own father worked until he was worthless, then discarded, thought of destiny learning from him what it meant to be human in a world that increasingly wasn't, thought of what kind of man he wanted to be in whatever time he had left. "Stop!" Samuel shouted, his voice stronger than it had been in years as he pushed his way toward the front. And when the driver glanced in the mirror, saying, "What?" "We're between stops, old man," Samuel demanded. "I need to get off now," with such authority, 70 years of survival, of absolute certainty, that the driver, grumbling and muttering about crazy old people, pulled to the side and opened the doors. Samuel didn't wait, descending the steps carefully but quickly, despite his knees screaming in protest, and started moving back the way they'd come. Not running because his body couldn't manage that anymore, but walking with the purposeful urgency of a man who'd made a decision he couldn't unmake while behind him the bus pulled away, carrying his carefully laid plans with it, each step back toward Margaret, sending pain through his joints, though Samuel had learned long ago to walk through pain because it was the invisible that killed you, not the ache. By the time Samuel reached Margaret, she had managed to sit on the curb with her back against a graffitied wall, her face pale, almost gray, taking slow measured breaths, the breathing technique of someone intimately familiar with managing chronic pain, when Samuel called out, "Ma'am, are you okay?" slowing his approach so as not to startle her. She looked up startled, her watery blue eyes widening slightly at the sight of an elderly black man in a suit moving toward her, and for a split second Samuel saw it, the flicker of conditioned fear, the reflexive tension he'd seen countless times across 7 decades that didn't surprise him anymore, just hurt in a quiet, constant way that had become part of his existence. He stopped a respectful distance away and raised one hand slightly, his folder still clutched in the other, saying, "I was on the bus. I saw what happened. I just want to help if I can." And Margaret's expression transformed immediately as the fear dissolved into shame, shame that she'd felt it in the first place, shame that Samuel had seen it, shame that added another layer to her visible distress as she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I'm just before," Samuel said gently, though they both knew it wasn't okay. "It's okay. Are you hurt?" "How bad is it?" Margaret touched her side tenderly, wincing as she explained, "My hip. I think I might have really damaged it this time. It's been deteriorating for a while, but this..." Trailing off as pain and fear tightened her features while Samuel knelt down slowly, his own knees protesting every inch of the descent, but keeping a respectful distance. "We need to get you some help. Do you have anyone I can call?" Samuel asked. And Margaret mentioned her son, who was always in meetings, before laughing bitterly, the sound coming out as more of a sob. "I was just trying to get to Northside. I volunteer at a children's literacy program there on Fridays. They're expecting me, the kids?" And her voice broke entirely. Samuel glanced around at the nearly deserted street where a few cars passed, but no one slowed. No one ever did, as he pulled out his flip phone and stared at it for a moment, realizing with sinking certainty that he had no idea how to access ride-sharing apps, even if he could afford one, because he'd never used them, never learned. He dialed 411 for directory assistance and got a taxi company number, only to be told, "We can get someone to you in about an hour and 15 minutes. Friday morning rush." And when Samuel protested, "An hour? This is an emergency. This woman is injured," the board dispatcher responded. "Sorry, sir, that's the best we can do," leaving Samuel to end the call with frustration building in his chest along with that dangerous pressure his doctor had warned about as he checked his watch. 8:33, 27 minutes until the interview. Samuel looked at Margaret, who was now shivering despite her coat as the wind picked up, carrying the promise of rain, her lips starting to lose color, and he made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. "Okay. We're going to get you to a hospital. Can you stand if I help you?" Margaret protested. "But how?" "You can't. You're..." catching herself but both hearing what she'd almost said. "You're too old before." Samuel responded with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been carrying things heavier than you for 70 years. Come on now, let's get you up." With considerable effort from both of them, with pain registering on both their faces, Samuel managed to help Margaret to her feet as she swayed, and he steadied her, his arm around her shoulders bearing more of her weight than his spine wanted to handle while he said, "There's a bus bench about a block that way. Let's get you somewhere better to sit while I figure this out." They moved slowly, with Samuel essentially carrying a significant portion of her weight, each step a negotiation between his determination and his body's limitations as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, and his heart hammered in his chest with a rhythm that concerned him. And halfway there, the sky opened up, releasing a cold drizzle that quickly soaked through their clothes. Samuel looked at his suit jacket, Martha's anniversary gift, his last connection to dignified employment, and then at Margaret's face, gray and trembling, realizing appearances didn't matter anymore as he shrugged off the jacket and draped it over Margaret's shoulders despite her weak protest of "You don't have to which he responded, "It's okay. I've got it." By the time they reached the bench, they were both drenched, Samuel easing Margaret down onto the wet surface before sitting beside her, his dress pants soaking through immediately while his white shirt clung to his chest, no longer crisp, no longer professional, as he looked at his watch reading. The interview had started 3 minutes ago. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, giving the dispatcher their location and asking how long, while trying to keep his voice steady despite the crushing weight settling on his chest, physical and emotional, before being told, "Paramedics en route. Approximately 15 to 20 minutes." Samuel ended the call and sat there, with rain dripping from his gray hair, his carefully maintained appearance dissolving in the downpour, as he looked at his watch again, showing 8:50 minutes into the interview he'd spent months securing, then stared at his flip phone's small screen, taking 3 tries to navigate the clumsy interface to access his email. Samuel stared at his phone, thinking what could he even say. "Sorry, I stopped to help someone and lost track of time, knowing they'd never believe it, and even if they did, it wouldn't matter. Because in a world of young, healthy, punctual workers, they had no reason to wait for a 70-year-old man who couldn't even arrive on time, because opportunity didn't wait for explanations, and at 70, opportunity rarely came at all." Margaret reached over and placed her wrinkled, cold hand on his, asking, "You were going somewhere important, weren't you?" And Samuel didn't answer right away, just stared at the water pooling on the pavement, reflecting the gray sky above and his gray future below, before finally nodding and admitting, "I had a job interview. Data entry position could have meant keeping our apartment, taking care of my granddaughter properly." Margaret's face crumpled with guilt and distress as she said, "Oh no, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." But Samuel really looked at her, and saw himself staring back. Another person the world had decided wasn't worth the inconvenience, as he said, "It's not your fault sometimes," his voice cracking. "Sometimes things just happen," Margaret said through tears mixing with rain. "But your interview is over because of me." And Samuel responded quietly, though the words tasted like ashes, "But you're going to be okay. That's what matters." Knowing it had to matter, because if it didn't, if this sacrifice meant nothing, then what? Had his 70 years been worth what? Lesson was he teaching destiny? That kindness was for people who could afford it. That dignity only mattered when it was convenient? Margaret asked, "Why did you stop for me?" And the question hung in the air heavier than the rain as Samuel thought about Martha, thought about destiny, thought about the man he saw in the mirror every morning, older, grayer, more tired with each passing year, and the man he still wanted to be with whatever time he had remaining. "Because no one else did," Samuel said simply. "And I'm too old to start becoming the kind of man who walks away when someone needs help at 70. If I'm not that man now, I never will be." The ambulance was still 15 minutes away, and Samuel sat on that bench in the rain, watching his last chance at financial security disappear minute by minute, knowing that at 70 there wouldn't be another interview, another opportunity, another chance. But in his pocket his phone would soon buzz with a message that would change everything. Message that would prove that sometimes the universe pays attention to the choices we make when no one is watching. Sometimes miracles aren't divine interventions, but just the consequences of refusing to become invisible even when the world insists you already are. And what happens when an act of kindness from a 70-year-old man connects him to the one person who could change his life forever would surprise everyone. Because this story, Samuel's story, was just beginning. The ambulance arrived 18 minutes later. It's red and white, lights painting the gray morning. In urgent colors as two paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes and a middle-aged man with efficient movements quickly assessed Margaret's condition while Samuel stood back, dripping wet and shivering, watching them work with the practiced precision of people who'd seen this scenario countless times. Possible hip fracture, vital stable, but she's in significant pain, the female paramedic said into her radio while her partner carefully stabilized Margaret for transport. And when they loaded her onto the stretcher, Margaret reached out and grabbed Samuel's hand with surprising strength, her eyes pleading. "Please don't leave me alone. I don't want to be alone," she whispered, her voice trembling not just from pain, but from the vulnerability of being elderly and injured and suddenly aware of her own mortality. And Samuel looked down at this woman he'd known for less than an hour, saw the fear in her eyes that mirrored what he'd seen in Martha's eyes during her final hospital stays, and without hesitation said, "I'm coming with you." The younger paramedic looked at him, really looked at him, taking in his soaked suit, his age, his exhaustion, and asked gently, "Are you family?" And Samuel, meeting her eyes with quiet dignity, responded, "I'm what she's got right now." And something in his tone, in the set of his shoulders despite being 70 and drenched and having just sacrificed everything, made the paramedic nod and say, "Okay, let's go." As Samuel climbed into the ambulance, his phone, still clutched in his hand, buzzed once with an email notification, but the doors closed before he could check it, and the ambulance pulled away from that desolate curb, carrying two elderly strangers, toward a hospital neither could afford, while somewhere across the city, a CEO named Richard Collins was about to discover that his mother never arrived at her volunteer position and wasn't answering her phone. St. Joseph's Medical Center smelled like antiseptic and institutional defeat as Samuel sat in the emergency waiting room, his damp clothes gradually drying into uncomfortable stiffness while fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that made everything feel more hopeless. The plastic chairs were too hard, the temperature too cold, and the television mounted in the corner was showing a morning talk show with the volume too low to hear properly but too high to ignore, displaying images of beautiful people with beautiful lives discussing problems that felt alien to everyone in this waiting room. Margaret had been taken for x-rays immediately upon arrival, and Samuel had waited, checking his phone every few minutes out of habit, though he didn't know what he was hoping to see. No messages, no missed calls. The world had kept spinning without him, just as it always did. Around him, the ER waiting room told 100 stories of mornings gone wrong. A construction worker holding a bloody towel to his hand, a mother with a feverish toddler, an elderly man coughing into a handkerchief, everyone looking tired, everyone looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, everyone carrying the particular exhaustion of being uninsured or underinsured in America. Samuel had answered questions from two different hospital staff members, both of whom had eyed him with barely concealed suspicion. One, a heavy-set security guard, had been particularly thorough, asking, "So you're saying you just helped her? You don't know her. What were you doing in that neighborhood?" With the automatic assumption Samuel had dealt with his entire life, the burden of proving innocence before being proven guilty. An hour passed, then another, and Samuel had long since given up on the interview, had sent a brief email, apologizing for missing it and citing a family emergency. It felt hollow, like a lie, even though it wasn't, and he didn't expect a response, because at 70, second chances didn't exist in the job market. But around 11:30 a.m., a nurse approached him saying, "Mr. Thompson?" And when he stood quickly, she continued, "Mrs. Collins is stable. She's got a fractured hip. Not a complete break, but enough that she'll need surgery and extensive recovery. We're keeping her for observation and possibly operating tomorrow." And before Samuel could process this information, the nurse added, "She's asking for you. Says she won't rest until she sees you're okay too." Samuel followed the nurse through the maze of hospital corridors to a room in the observation ward where Margaret was propped up in bed, looking small and fragile against the white sheets, an IV taped to her arm and monitors beeping steadily beside her, but her eyes brightened when she saw him enter. "You stayed," she said, her voice stronger than it had been on the curb, and Samuel pulled up a chair beside the bed, settling into it with a sigh that released some of the tension he'd been carrying for hours. Responding, "Couldn't just leave you here alone." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that only happens between people who've shared something profound. While outside the window, the rain had stopped and weak sunlight was trying to break through the clouds, and Margaret said suddenly, "I used to be a teacher, 5th grade mostly, taught for 42 years at Lincoln Elementary on the south side," her voice taking on a quality of nostalgia mixed with pride. Samuel leaned forward with genuine interest, asking, 42 years? That's incredible." And Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her face, making her look younger despite the pain and the hospital setting. "It was my life, my late husband. George used to joke that I loved those kids more than I loved him. Maybe I did in a way. You know how it is when you see a child struggling and you find that one key that unlocks their potential. That moment when they finally understand something they've been wrestling with. Nothing in the world quite like it." Samuel nodded slowly, thinking of Destiny and her math homework, thinking of all the teachers who'd believed in him when he was young, thinking of how different his life might have been without them. And he said, "Sounds like you were good at it." Margaret's expression grew serious as she said, "I saw so many kids come through my classroom. Kids from every background you can imagine, some with everything handed to them, some with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But the thing I learned after all those years is that kindness doesn't have a demographic. Good people come from everywhere, and they look like everyone." And she looked at Samuel directly, her blue eyes piercing, adding, "You gave up something important today to help me, didn't you?" And when Samuel tried to deflect with, "It doesn't matter," Margaret reached over and placed her hand on his, saying, "It does matter. It matters because you did it anyway. Because when everyone else looked away, you didn't," her voice cracking slightly. "Why did you stop for me?" And Samuel was preparing to answer, when the door suddenly burst open and a tall man in an expensive suit entered, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight with controlled panic as he said, "I understand that, Margaret, but tell them we're not moving on the contract until—" Before stopping mid-sentence when he saw Margaret in the hospital bed. "Richard," Margaret said, her face lighting up despite the circumstances, and the man, Richard Collins, CEO of Sterling Technologies, though Samuel didn't know that yet, ended his call immediately and rushed to his mother's side, his expensive Italian shoes clicking on the hospital floor. "Mom, the hospital called me. They said you fell, that you're going to need surgery," Richard said, his voice tight with worry as he took her hand, and Samuel could see the love there, the genuine concern that transcended whatever business demands had kept him in meetings while his mother rode buses alone. And Margaret responded, "It's not as bad as it sounds. I've got good doctors," and gesturing towards Samuel, "and I had help. This is Samuel Thompson. He saved me, Richard. I fell on the bus and the driver left me on the side of the road. Samuel got off the bus and stayed with me, called the ambulance, rode with me here. He's been here all morning making sure I was okay." Richard's eyes finally landed on Samuel, who had stood when he entered, instinctively making himself smaller in the presence of obvious wealth and power, and Samuel watched Richard's expression shift through several emotions, surprise, suspicion, and finally something that might have been grudging respect. Before, Richard extended his hand, saying, "Thank you. I thank you," his voice thick with emotion. Samuel shook his hand, noting the expensive watch, the tailored suit that probably cost more than Samuel's monthly rent, the confidence that came from never having to check his bank balance before buying groceries. And he said simply, "Just did what anyone should have done." Richard stared at Samuel for a long moment, his businessman's brain clearly processing something, before pulling out his wallet and flipping through the bills inside, saying, "Please, let me give you something for your trouble, for the time you've lost." And Samuel felt his spine stiffen, felt the familiar sting of being reduced to someone who could be paid off, someone whose kindness needed to be transacted rather than simply accepted. and the word came out sharper than he intended. No, then softer. No, thank you, I don't want money. I just wanted to make sure your mother was safe. And Richard stood there with his wallet still open, clearly unaccustomed to people refusing his money, before slowly closing it and putting it away, his expression unreadable. And Margaret broke the tension by saying, Samuel had a job interview this morning. He missed it to help me. It was at, she paused, trying to remember. Sterling something? Sterling Technologies? And Samuel watched Richard's face transform, watched realization dawn like sunrise, watched the CEO of Sterling Technologies understand exactly who was standing in front of him. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to shock to something Samuel couldn't quite read as he said slowly, Sterling Technologies, that's my company. I'm the CEO, and then, processing further, wait, what time was your interview? And when Samuel answered quietly, 9 a.m., Junior Data Entry Specialist position. Richard pulled out his phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen before he looked up and said, Samuel Thompson, you applied 3 months ago. You have a degree in computer science from Chicago State, 40 years of manufacturing experience, references that called you one of the most reliable workers we've ever had. You were supposed to meet with our HR director and the department manager this morning. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of Margaret's monitors as the full weight of the coincidence, or perhaps not coincidence, settled over all three of them, and Samuel found himself unable to speak, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name, while Margaret looked between her son and Samuel with tears forming in her eyes. Richard stood there, this powerful CEO in his expensive suit, and Samuel could see him thinking, calculating, processing the impossible chain of events that had brought them to this moment. And finally Richard said, You gave up your interview, possibly your last chance at employment at your age. I'm not naive about how the job market treats older workers. To help my mother, a complete stranger, his voice growing stronger, more certain. You sat in the rain, you rode in the ambulance. You've been here for hours making sure she was okay, and you don't want money. You don't want recognition. You just... Richard stopped, seemingly overwhelmed by the simple purity of Samuel's choice. And Margaret said softly, He asked me why I did what I did. And I told him because no one else did. Richard pulled out his phone again, this time to make a call, stepping slightly away from the bed but still within earshot as he said, Jennifer, this is Richard Collins. I need you to pull up our interview. Schedule from this morning, the data entry, position 9 a.m. Candidate was Samuel Thompson. And after a pause, Yes, I know he didn't show. I know protocol says we move to the second choice. But I'm going to need you to do something for me. And Samuel's heart began to pound because surely this wasn't happening. Surely the universe didn't actually reward kindness like some fairy tale. Surely at 70 he'd learned that life didn't work this way. But Richard continued, I want you to reschedule Mr. Thompson's interview for Monday morning, 9 a.m. And Jennifer, he paused, his eyes finding Samuel's, put it in my calendar, because I'm going to be in the room for this one personally. And when he ended the call, the silence in the room was deafening. Richard turned back to face Samuel and Margaret. His expression transformed from the controlled businessman's mask to something more human, more vulnerable, as he said, Mr. Thompson, I can't offer you the data entry position. And Samuel felt his heart sink, felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over him like a familiar coat. Of course, it had been too good to be true, of course, but Richard continued, because I'm offering you something better. Samuel stood frozen, not understanding, while Richard pulled up a chair and sat down, making himself level with Samuel in a gesture that felt deliberately egalitarian, and explained Sterling Technologies has been trying to develop a corporate mentorship program for 2 years. We want to pair experienced workers with our younger staff, people who can teach not just technical skills but work ethic, reliability, the intangibles that you can't learn from a textbook or a training video. Richard leaned forward, his intensity focused entirely on Samuel now. I've built a successful company, Mr. Thompson, but I did it by recognizing talent and character when I see it. And what you did today, walking away from your own future to help a stranger, that's the kind of character I want in my organization. That's the kind of example I want my employees to see every day. Margaret was crying openly now, her hand over her mouth, while Samuel tried to process what he was hearing his 70-year-old mind struggling to accept that this was real, not some stress-induced hallucination, brought on by hours of worry and physical strain. "I'm offering you a position as Senior Workforce Development Advisor," Richard said, pulling out his phone to show Samuel something. $55,000 a year to start, full benefits. Your job would be to help train new employees, mentor young workers, and help me build a company culture that values experience and character, as much as it values technical skills. And Samuel finally found his voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Why? You don't know me? You don't know if I'm even qualified for—" Richard interrupted gently. "Mr. Thompson, Samuel, I just watched you sacrifice what might have been your last employment opportunity to help my mother. You spent hours in a hospital waiting room to make sure a stranger was okay. You refused money because you didn't do it for reward. You did it because it was right." And his voice grew stronger, more passionate. "That's not something I can teach. That's not something I can train into people. That's character. And character is the foundation of everything else." And Margaret reached out to take Samuel's hand, squeezing it gently while Richard continued. "Besides, my mother just told me you have a 12-year-old granddaughter you're raising, which means you understand responsibility, you understand sacrifice, you understand what it means to show up every day, even when it's hard, and those are exactly the qualities I need in someone who's going to help shape the next generation of workers at my company." And Samuel felt tears burning in his eyes, felt 70 years of struggle and invisibility and being overlooked suddenly, transformed into something that mattered. Someone who was seen, someone who was valued. But he had to ask, what if I'm not good enough? What if I can't do what you need? Richard smiled, a genuine warm expression that transformed his CEO face into something more human, and said, "Samuel, you're 70 years old and you just spent half a day in the rain and in a hospital to help a stranger. If you can do that, you can handle anything I throw at you, and more importantly, if you fail, it won't be because you didn't try. It won't be because you didn't care, and that's all I can ask of anyone." Samuel looked at Margaret, who was nodding encouragingly through her tears, then back at Richard, and felt something shift deep in his chest. Something that had been locked tight for years beginning to open. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, the universe did occasionally pay attention to the choices people made when no one was watching. "I accept," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I accept your offer, Mr. Collins, and I promise you won't regret it. I'll work harder than anyone." But Richard held up a hand, stopping him. "Samuel, you've already proven everything you need to prove. Now you just need to show up and be yourself. Teach our young people what you know, show them what real character looks like. That's the job." They shook hands, this time not as CEO and desperate job seeker, but as two men who'd found unexpected connection through crisis and kindness. And Margaret said from her bed, "This is what it looks like when the universe pays attention, when good people are finally recognized for being good." And Samuel felt his phone buzz in his pocket, pulled it out to see a text from Destiny. "How did the interview go?" "I've been praying all morning." And Samuel smiled through his tears as he typed back, "Baby girl, let me tell you a story about this morning." Richard stood and said, "Samuel, I have to get back to the office for a critical meeting, but I'll have my assistant, Jennifer, contact you this afternoon with all the details, paperwork, start date, everything." And as he was leaving, he paused at the door and turned back, his expression thoughtful. "My mother told me something once, when I was young and struggling to get my company off the ground. She said, 'Richard, success isn't about how much money you make or how many people work for you. Success is about whether you can look in the mirror and respect the person looking back.' And I've tried to live by that. But somewhere along the way, I think I forgot." And he looked at Samuel with something like gratitude. "Thank you for reminding me what that really means." And then he was gone, leaving Samuel and Margaret alone in the hospital room where the afternoon sun was finally breaking through the clouds. And Samuel realized he was still wearing his damp, wrinkled suit, still looked like a disaster. But for the first time in years, maybe in decades, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Samuel sat with Margaret for another hour, the two of them talking like old friends despite having met only that morning, sharing stories of their lives, Margaret describing her 42 years of teaching, the students who'd stayed in touch, the small triumphs and heartbreaks of working with children from struggling families, while Samuel told her about his manufacturing career, about losing Martha, about destiny and the weight of trying to raise a 12-year-old girl on a 70-year-old's failing body and depleted bank account. "You're going to be okay now," Margaret said, her voice warm with certainty. "Richard means what he says. When he makes a commitment, he follows through. You and Destiny are going to have a real chance." Now, and Samuel felt his throat tighten because he'd spent so long not daring to hope, not allowing himself to believe things could get better, that hearing someone else say it with such confidence felt almost painful. A nurse came in to administer medication, and Margaret's eyes began to droop as the pain medication took effect. And Samuel stood carefully, his 70-year-old joints protesting after hours in the uncomfortable hospital chair, and said gently, "I should let you rest. You need to save your strength for the surgery tomorrow." Margaret reached out and grabbed his hand one more time, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail, and said, "Samuel Thompson, you came into my life for a reason this morning. I believe the universe puts people in our path when we need them most." Her eyes filling with tears again. "You saved my life today, and I will never forget it." The miracle isn't that Samuel's life changed. The miracle is that he changed others' lives first, and the universe simply recognized what he'd already become, a man who chose dignity over desperation, compassion over convenience, and humanity over self-preservation. May we all make such choices when our moment comes.